Thank you all for having me. This is my first time in Hong Kong, and it's been a wonderful experience. And I'm not as good at standing still as Professor Carpenter is. And after spending 16 and a half hours on the plane, I'm going to walk around a little bit while I talk. My area of expertise is in management and leadership and organizational citizenship behavior, and also about evidence-based management. And it was when they invited me to come talk and talk about how my research applies to practice, I found that to be a very exciting but also challenging idea, because it really makes you look back on the research that you've done and say, what does it really mean? What can we really do with it? How does it inform practice? And how can you use it? So I'm going to go through today and talk about my sort of view on evidence-based management, and then talk about also some of my research, and just touch on a couple, 3 or 4 different studies that I think actually provide some practitioner tools that leaders can use to be better leaders and better managers. So I'd like to start off with a couple of quotes, because I think in business we run into lots of problems, and I've been talking with several of the different researchers and professors here today, and talking about how lots of issues are just, and research ideas are just things that we've reinvented or given new names, right? Given new terms. And even sort of one of the fathers of modern management thought, Peter Drucker, said that most business issues are generic repetitions of familiar problems cloaked in the guise of uniqueness. We just give these problems new names, new ideas, new theories, new ways of measuring, and reinvent them and publish about them again. And Richard Feynman in 1974 said, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. One of the first things I like to tell people is to realize that we are biased by our own research, by our own ideas, and by our own perspectives. And as soon as we realize that, then we can start to try to conduct research and be a practitioner that realizes our own weaknesses. And I think Professor Carpenter had some great ideas about how we should think about the way that we think of ourselves and the way that we think that others think about ourselves, right? Because that has an impact on how we act and the behaviors that we justify. So I'm a professor, and what do people think about professors? What do you class exercise, right? Just like Professor Carpenter. One of the things that we say about professors, at least in the United States, is that they're absent-minded, right? They forget about things. They're late to things, right? Joseph had to make sure that I was down here at the right time because I was in conversation with people. And so when we think about ourselves as this stereotype as the absent-minded professor, that causes us to act in ways that are consistent with that stereotype, right? So our own views of ourselves and our view that we think others have of us impacts how we act, how we lead, how we manage. So one of the things about evidence-based management that I think is fascinating is that it's really not that difficult, right? It's using evidence along with common sense to make management decisions that are scientifically and practically sound. So I'll use an example from an American sport. If anybody has seen the movie Moneyball, Brad Pitt was in the movie Moneyball, right? And it was about, David, you'll like this, it was about a Harvard-trained economist who started studying baseball, right? And the question is, before Moneyball was the application of econometrics to the sport of baseball. Baseball loves statistics, right? But before this idea of Moneyball and applying econometrics to baseball, how did recruiters and managers find baseball players? Well, in the movie, there's a clip of a bunch of talent scouts, baseball scouts, sitting in a room, figuring out which players they're going to draft or they're going to try to sign for the next season. And they talk about really scientific things like, what a player's girlfriend looks like, because they think the way that the player's girlfriend looks says something about his psychology and his confidence, and therefore his ability to play baseball, right? I wouldn't call that evidence-based management. But then you bring in Moneyball, or the idea of applying statistics to baseball, complex statistics. Instead of looking at batting averages, they looked at things like on-base percentage or runs scored, or things that they saw that actually mattered, the outcomes that mattered. Ultimately, in baseball, when you're signing a player to a contract, you're trying to buy one of two things. You're trying to buy runs if you're signing an offensive player, or if you're signing a pitcher, you're trying to prevent runs, right? You need to buy more runs than you give up, ultimately. And so that's the idea of how this guy, Paul De Podesta, revolutionized baseball. It was first applied to the Oakland Athletics baseball team, and they had one of the lowest payrolls in baseball, and were able to compete at a very high level in the world of Major League Baseball. Because they used statistics, they used evidence-based management in the area of sport. So, that's kind of the idea of what I think of when I think of evidence-based management, is applying these, whether it's econometrics ideas or other statistical principles, along with common sense and stakeholder ideas, to making management decisions. So a little preview. So how do managers tend to make flawed decisions? Because I think we all make flawed decisions. A lot of times we get lucky, but we make flawed decisions, whether it's because of our own biases or because we're not able to see certain parts of the data, or we have ulterior motives. And we'll talk about those in just a minute. We'll talk about what is EBM, or evidence-based management. How can we do it? We'll talk about where do we find evidence. And then I'm going to talk about what I've learned over my 20 years of research, which seemed like a long time until I was sat next to two emeritus professors who were also speaking at this conference, John. Thank you. And so one of the most valuable things I found about coming to Hong Kong, though, besides it's a beautiful city, my wife came with me and we are exploring the city a little bit in our spare time, is the new friends that I've made by coming here. That's probably the most valuable thing that I've found coming here, whether it's meeting professors from other places or from Shuyuan University. So then we'll talk about wrap-up, takeaways, and some questions. So, anecdotes versus the ivory tower. Now, when people, and maybe some of the other professors here can relate to this, when people ask me what I do out in public, I meet somebody, I met a guy on the cable car coming from Big Buddha yesterday, right? And the guy, I asked him what he did, and he told me he does contracts for, he's in charge of contracts for an interior redecorating company. That makes perfect sense, right? He has a job, they produce the inside of these buildings. And he said, and what do you do? And I'm always nervous when I answer, because then I say, well, I'm a management professor. And the next question is usually, or the next statement is, oh, you should come to where I work, because we have a really bad culture and you could fix our culture, right? And so I now have a response to that. I say to them, oh, I'm sorry, but I can't fix culture. I can only fix behavior. And culture is the conglomeration of all behaviors within that business, right? But a lot of the study of behavior, of management, of the ways that we make decisions is guided not by research, but by the popular press, right? If I asked you who Stephen Covey is, many of you would recognize his name as an American management or in leadership author, right? And if you went to Amazon and did a search for Stephen Covey, you would get 250 different items that he's either authored or co-authored, and sold millions of copies of books. But if you go look in those books, there's very little data or evidence behind what he says or the recommendations that he gives. But they're sold very well, right? They're marketed well. And I think that's where most of our decision-making comes from, is by well-marketed materials rather than well-researched materials. Now, if you are somebody who is familiar with IO psychology or the management field, if I asked you who Tim Judge is, you would probably know. But if you're not in that field, you would probably have no idea who Tim Judge is. Tim Judge is probably one of the most published management scholars over the last 2 decades in the area of meta-analysis. Right? He has published, he became incredibly prolific at producing these meta-analytic studies, meaning taking 10 or 20 years or 50 years of research, summarizing it statistically into one study to see what all the research says. But if you ask any manager out there in the field, do they know who Tim Judge is? No, nobody knows who he is, right? Outside of the academic world. So what's the difference? Well, one of them is very well researched, right? He has very sound ideas from his meta-analytic research and reviews. The other is wildly popular management author. Which one has more decisions based on his work? Probably Stephen Covey, right? Because he is the more popular, well-published, and well-marketed decision maker. So, whereas Tim Judge has 165 plus refereed journal articles, 39 book chapters, and 50 plus news media citations, most practitioners don't know who he is. So our job is to bridge that gap between Stephen Covey and Tim Judge and say, how do we take research that we do and apply it to leadership, management, and other parts of the business field? So, how decisions are often influenced? Well, our decisions are influenced by our cognitive biases, right? We all are biased by our own views, by our own background, by what we study. We're biased by our culture, by the things that we pay attention to, by who pays us and what pays our bills, right? All of those things influence us. We also have ulterior motives, meaning motives that everyone that we're working with don't necessarily know that we have, but I would go a step further and say that we have ulterior motives that even we don't know that we have. So one of the things that I have found as I've moved into my new role as the director of an MBA program is that I want people to work for me who are going to question my motives and ask me why I'm doing the things I'm doing, because often I don't even know why I'm doing the things that I'm doing, right? I may have a motive that I can't even see, or one that I'm projecting that I don't even realize when I'm making a decision, because I'm doing something that's in my own favor even if I don't realize it. So, there are also things that influence our decisions, such as management fads, right? Whether it's TQM, management circles, what else? Being a black belt in some management fad, or it's consultants. And what do consultants do? What is the job of a management consultant? Well, on the surface, it is the management consultant's job to fix your problems, right? But if I'm a really good management consultant, do I ever want to actually fix all of your problems? No. Why not? Because I'm going to put myself out of business, right? If I fix all your problems, you're going to move down the road, and I have to find a new client. If I'm a really good management consultant, what I want to do is fix enough of your problems that you hire me back again, right? I don't want to fix everything. I don't want to teach you to fish. I just want to keep feeding you fish, right? So, management fads, consultants, politics, and incentives. We are subject to politics. We are subject to incentives, things that incentivize us or our programs or who we're working for, as well as organizational politics. We all are familiar with organizational politics influencing decisions, and I'll give you a very expensive example of that here in a few minutes. Just to solidify this a little bit, I wanted to put something up here that I think helps us understand that we all have different cognitive biases and we see the world in different ways. Now, many of you may have seen this image before, but it is one of the classic images that people use to see how people see the world. So, what do you see here? How many of you say, I just see a random ink blob, right? Does anyone see an old woman? Yeah, a few of you see an old woman, right? She's all tucked in like this with her pursed lips and her big nose, right? Our noses never stop growing. That's part of biology, and so the older you get, the bigger your nose gets, and then her eyes and her dark hair and her hood. Does anybody see a pretty young woman? Yeah, right? You've seen this before, I know. Does anybody not see the pretty young woman? Volunteers to say you can't see the pretty young woman. Surely there's somebody, all right? So if you don't see the pretty young woman, let me see if I get the button right here. Instead of the old woman's chin down here with her pursed lips, the young woman's chin is here, her nose is here, and her long, pretty eyelashes are there, and she's looking away from you. In any room, there's usually about 50% of the people see the old woman, and 50% see the young woman. And then there's like 5% that go, I don't see anything, right? We all see the world in different ways. Our brains work differently. And one of the things that I usually ask crowds if I'm talking to them is, if I was going to ask you for directions to your home or your apartment, how would you give me those directions, right? Now, I live in a very car-centric world, so all of our directions are given based on driving a car someplace. So if I was going to ask you for directions to your home, how many of you would tell me street names and north, south, east, and west in order to get to your home? Anybody? That's the way you would give directions? One? Yeah? Anybody? How many people give directions based on left and right at the big blue building? How many people go that way, right? Yeah, so we think in different ways. I'm highway and street names and directions, right? And my wife, who's out touring the town right now, she turns left at the big red barn, right? So if I'm giving directions, I have to put them into her terms. So we all have our own biases and our ways of seeing the world. So that impacts how we make decisions. The other things we run into are these management fads, whether they're quality circles or TQM from the 1980s, or in the 1990s when we were going to manage all of the knowledge. If you remember, one of the great things that was going to come out of computers was that we were going to be able to take all the knowledge out of everyone's heads and put it into a database where if you had any questions, instead of calling someone or looking it up, what would you do? You would go into this database of knowledge, right, and find it. And what we find is that people still call us and ask the questions, right, because we have not learned to manage data and knowledge well. The only great system I would say is out there for knowledge management is Google, right? You can Google anything in the world and find out just about whatever you want. You could build a new car based on information you get from YouTube, right? So knowledge management was a fad, talent management, outsourcing, lean management, leading change, managing change. All of these management fads have influenced how we make decisions. Now, why do we care about evidence-based practice? Why is it important? Well, it's because it helps us make better decisions. And sometimes those decisions are slow, drawn-out decisions that you're able to research, right, and look for the data and the information, check with the stakeholders, and find out what the right decision is. Other times, though, you don't have time to do the research. You have to have already done the research and had the research in your head and practice the decisions in order to make the decision in an instantaneous moment. And that moment can change the course of many people's lives, right? Now, I joked earlier with Professor Carpenter when he put this picture up there of the researcher, and I said the real doctor, right? Because many times we get separated from the real doctors. My friends like to say to me, there are two kinds of doctors in this world. There's the kind that help people, and the other kind. You're the other kind, right? That keeps me humble. So a lot of times we have to have that research and evidence in our heads already and have practiced the decision, because it can have huge impacts not only on people's careers but on people's lives. If you remember Sully, right? Captain Sully. He saved hundreds of lives by landing a plane in a river in New York with 200 and something people alive. The only injury was a sprained ankle. He was a hero. Still is a hero. But if you ask him how he saved all those lives, it wasn't the moment when he landed the plane. It was the 40 years of evidence and study of how planes worked and how you would land a plane in a water landing situation. So evidence-based management, evidence-based decision-making can have instantaneous decision ramifications if you are prepared for it in the future. You don't always have time to compile the research and the data to make a decision. Now, why do we need it? Because we have bounded rationality, right? We like to assume that we're rational individuals. But what science has found is that we are rational to a degree. We want to be rational, but we have all these biases and ulterior motives that limit us. I think of our rationality sort of like a wrinkle-resistant shirt, right? How many of you ever bought a wrinkle-resistant garment? And you said, great, I won't have to iron it, I won't have to have it dry cleaned, I'll just put it in the washer, put it in the dryer, and it will come out smooth and flat. Does it ever work? No, they always have wrinkles. And I heard a guy one time say they're wrinkle resistant, which means that they will wrinkle, they just won't like it, right? They're resistant, but they still will wrinkle. So we are in the same way. We want to be rational, and we want to be free of our ulterior motives and our biases, but we can't ever completely get away from them. So we have bounded rationality. We have these management fads. We have consultants. We have power and politics at play that influence how we make our decisions. I was in a session earlier where we were talking about employee well-being and leadership and whether employee well-being matters in the workplace. And we started talking about management fads and personality. And my wife the other day came to me and she said, you need to read this really great book. It's about the Enneagram. Anybody familiar with the Enneagram personality measure? It's a, 40, 50-year-old personality measure that has been popularized by a new popular book. And I said, really? I need to read another book about a personality measure that's been around for 40 years, right, that has very little scientific backing to it. One friend of mine calls it personality astrology, if you will, right? The assigning of personality types because it makes us all comfortable. I said, what about the Big Five? Does anybody actually use the Big Five personality measure to make decisions about individual personalities and the type of person that you are or the type of person that you hire? It's just another example of how fads replace science in the management area. So evidence-based management is something that we use in our everyday lives, but we don't use it in our professional lives that much. What do I mean by that? Well, you wouldn't travel to a new city, right, without looking up, or go see a movie without looking up whether I should go see it. At least in the United States, we use a web page called Rotten Tomatoes, right, which tells us how good a movie is and how many tomatoes it gets. So we use evidence accumulated by web pages to decide what movie to go see. If I believe in Asia, they use AMP. Is that a relatively equal comparison? But someplace that you could go research movies, right? Which hotel should I book in a city I've never been to before? We would use TripAdvisor, right? Quite often. We use thousands and thousands of observations about hotels or other attractions to go to in order to decide where we're going to stay. I came up with what I think is an Asian equivalent, but my references may be off here, right? What kind of car should I buy? In the United States, we would use Auto Trader or any number of other web pages. There's another one now that tells you about the price and how good that price is relative to the market. I believe that would be the Asian equivalent of an Auto Trader, right? So we use all this evidence. Which washer should I buy? We might use Consumer Reports or go to Alibaba or go to Amazon.com and get all the reviews from thousands of individuals to help us to make these decisions about these simple everyday life purchases. But we don't do the same thing in management. We don't go seek out data. We don't seek the reviews of others. We make decisions by the seat of our pants. So the underlying logic of evidence-based management is that practitioners in any field routinely make decisions and judgments about interventions, about purchase decisions, about investments, and yet we don't use research very often to make these decisions. Those decisions should be based on information of various and many types, meaning we should go seek out advice from others, we should seek out economic data, we should seek out personality information, whatever it happens to be that applies to that setting. Using only a little evidence or evidence that is not relevant or valid is likely to produce poor decisions and poorer outcomes. Much like using groups to make decisions doesn't necessarily cause us to make better decisions. I think one of the biggest assumptions we have in the management field is that if we bring a group of individuals together to make a decision, that decision will be superior to when individuals make that decision. But what the data actually shows us is that that's not always true. What we find is that groups tend to make more extreme decisions in one direction or the other, more risky decisions or more extremely conservative decisions than the individual would. Partly because that individual, if they make a decision, they have to own it. If the group makes a decision, who owns that decision? This amorphous unit we call the group, or in Professor Carpenter's case earlier today, the system, right? We blame the system for a series of bad decisions rather than some individual who makes that decision. So using more and more relevant and valid evidence is likely to produce better decisions and outcomes than individuals or groups just making decisions on their own. So what is evidence-based management or evidence-based practice? It is the conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of the best available evidence in a decision-making process by asking a question and finding out what the real question is that we're asking. Are we trying to solve a symptom or are we trying to solve a real problem? By acquiring information. Now the question is, where do you acquire that information? And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. By appraising that information and seeing how valid that information is. So somebody comes to you with a personality assessment. Do you read the abstract and the intro and get wooed by how well the person writes? Or are you like me and immediately flip to the back of the book to look at the reference section to see if there's any science behind the actual personality assessment? By aggregating the data, by bringing data in from multiple sources, sort of like your own little meta-analytic study of your problem, to help make that decision. We'll talk about those different sources in a few minutes. By applying what you've learned to the decision, and then maybe the most important is then assessing the decision and finding out, did we actually make the best decision that we could have, and how is that performing for our organization, for our company, for our school, for our classroom, whatever it happens to be. Well, better yet, evidence-based management is about making decisions through the conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of 4 sources of information. I think if you use these 4 sources, that you'll be much more successful in the decisions that you make moving forward. 1, practitioner expertise and judgment. So I have this new role that I've told you about that may be one of the best roles and the biggest mistakes I've ever made, becoming the director of an MBA program, right? At least in the school that I work in, the MBA program is a program that brings together classes from a number of different departments and offers them to students, right, in a rotation so that they can get a master level degree in a couple of years. The problem with that is you don't actually have any power over any of these departments or the faculty that teach in this program, right? So you have to find ways to get people to want to teach in this program. So this has been a very challenging but exciting job for me, but one of the things that we have had to do is figure out how to grow a program. Now, one of the challenges of that is that our MBA program actually encompasses 3 MBA programs. So we have our traditional campus at our rural school between Oklahoma City and Tulsa, Oklahoma, in a small town called Stillwater of about 30,000 people, an hour from either metropolitan area. So that's our full-time MBA program, traditional program. We have a professional MBA program on our Tulsa campus and in a metro setting. Much different than the full-time on-campus program. It has working professionals who take classes part-time and take anywhere from 2 to 5 years to finish their MBA. We also have an online MBA program, right, that is spread across the globe. I teach in that program, and I've had students ranging from U.S. military who are working somewhere in the Middle East, and it can only tell me that they are somewhere in the Middle East and cannot give me their exact location, to students sitting in a dorm room in their pajamas working on their computer rather than going to class. So these are 3 very different programs for which we have to make decisions for marketing, curriculum, faculty, and budgeting. So I came into this position and said, okay, we want to grow these programs. How are we going to grow these programs? Where are we marketing these programs? They said, well, we have a couple of billboards in Oklahoma City, the biggest city in Oklahoma. I said, okay, how much are those costing you a month? A couple of $1,000s a month each, right? What else are you doing? Well, we're advertising on the radio. Well, where are you advertising on the radio? On something called NPR, National Public Radio. This is where they talk about news and current events. And it has a very, I would say, educated and older demographic. All right? So my first question is, okay, what are you getting from these things? And they said, what do you mean, what are you getting from these things? I said, well, what are you getting? What's your return on investment for a billboard in Oklahoma City that you're spending $2,000 a month on? And they said, well, we don't know. I said, what do you mean you don't know? We're in a business school. You're spending $2,000 a month on a billboard, and you don't know what the return on that investment is. Well, here's the real story. This took me a while to get them to give me the real story, is that we have to have that billboard in Oklahoma City. And I said, wait a minute, why do we have to have a billboard in Oklahoma City? Well, we have a lot of alumni who live in Oklahoma City, and they like to see the billboard as they drive down the highway about their MBA program, right? That's their definition of return on investment. I said, cancel the billboards. And they were not very happy about that. I said, we're not trying to keep our alumni happy. We're trying to recruit students. We have a limited marketing budget. We need to make decisions that are going to put students in the classroom. And so what about the radio? What's your return on investment on the radio? Oh, well, you know, I have lots of people tell me they hear the ads on the radio. Well, have you had any students tell you that they signed up for the MBA program because they heard about the advertisement on the radio? No, because if you go and look at the demographic of people who listen to national public radio, they already have a master's degree and they're 40 to 70 years old. Doesn't fit our demographic. So I went to them and said, we have to change how we're marketing the program. We have to market our program through digital advertising, through Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Spotify, Apple Music, and those various outlets where our demographic is actually subject to. So, and I'll come back to some of that evidence here in a little while. You also have to have critical evaluation of the best available research. You need to go look at the research, look at the data, look at the evidence. Now, the hard part of that is most of the data and the evidence that you can get about marketing an MBA program is brought to you by people who are doing what? Selling you advertising, right? So it's very hard to get unbiased information regarding what you're trying to do. So you have to dig, you have to look at it critically and evaluate it for yourself. So the final part is getting the perspectives of those affected. That's looking at the students, asking them where they got their information, how they found out about your program, and finding out what marketing does and how that actually impacts people coming into your program. Quite often, though, we use evidence as anecdote. We have new breakthroughs, but they're rarely new and are often misguided. What do I mean by that? Well, when I'm reviewing papers that are based on research, they're research based on other research. They cite a paper and say that Bowler 2012 said that leaders should do this, right? But if I go dig and actually look at Bowler 2012, he doesn't actually have any evidence that says that. He just said it based on 3 theories that he read, and then that next person on the next paper quotes that as fact, and that becomes a law within the leadership literature. And so quite often these anecdotes, this anecdotal evidence we have is based on somebody misquoting somebody else, and that becoming treated as fact or law within a field. So researchers themselves can be fatally flawed or fatally biased. How biased can we be? Well, I'm actually working with some medical researchers from our medical school at Oklahoma State, and we're working on a social network analysis of a Japanese guy by the name of Yoshihiro Sato. Does anybody recognize that name? So Sato you've heard of him, Professor Carpenter, did medical research in the orthopedics area for years, and it turned out that this webpage that looks at research and tests to see if it's legitimate found that almost all of his studies and all of his data were fake. And people were treating orthopedic patients based on decades of falsified data and fake research. And what they found was that this gentleman, Sato, actually was the center of this network of researchers that produced this falsified data. And apparently in Japan, this is a widespread problem within the medical research field. So we are actually doing a network analysis to see how far this network goes and to see if there are other central players in this falsified data medical research. So that's an extreme example, but at the other end is the poetic treatment of data points that don't fit with what our story, the story that we're trying to tell, right? We all look at data and say, oh, well, that person's an outlier. Well, is that person truly an outlier? Or is it just that that person's data doesn't tell us what we want it to say, right? We want our data to support our hypotheses, and we want it to be a very strong p-value so that the editor will believe us and publish our research, right? Because we all have ulterior motives, not just that our research is strong and good, but that we get our research published, we get tenure, and we get to continue in this wonderful field we call academics, right? So even we as academics have ulterior motives to publish our research. At the end of the day, common sense rules. We should be able to look at data and be able to tell and make common sense judgments about whether something makes sense. If it looks too good to be true, it always is, right? Not just usually, but always. Now I have several slides left, and I'm realizing I'm running up against my Q&A time here. So what types of research should we examine? Well, they're data-driven books that bring together all of the research in an area. Very valuable. They're Harvard Business Review articles. However, I think even Harvard Business Review articles that quite often summarize other research get treated as anecdotal evidence that everybody should make decisions in a certain way. Growing up, I played golf. And one of the worst things that you could do was go read Golf Digest, right, or any other golf magazine, because they would have some suggestion for how you should change your golf swing to become a better golfer. And they would apply it to everyone out there. So you would go look at this suggestion on how you should change your golf swing, go to the driving range and apply it to your golf swing, and you would get 5 to 10 shots worse, right? Because you're applying some rubber-stamped solution to a problem that you don't have. And so it actually makes you worse rather than better. So I think that happens a lot with lots of different kinds of information, whether it be Harvard Business Review or Wall Street Journal or other articles out there. Data-driven articles. They're theory-driven articles. And as I said, they're very valuable. I've written and published some myself, but I think quite often they get misquoted as fact, and they are only theory-based. Data-driven articles can be very valuable, but they're applied to a very narrow context. They're not very generalizable very often. All of the research that I have done has been on primarily, Western white male data sources that may or may not apply to other populations around the world. Review articles, meta-analysis can all be very valuable. Summary articles. There are all kinds of data out there that we can find. Finding evidence can be hard. There are ways to find it. Again, consultants and professors, but again, we all have our own ulterior motives. Societies and organizations, journals, magazines, books, ProQuest, ABI, Google, Yahoo. There's so much information out there now, and we still use so very little of it to make our decisions. Now, let me give you a few research examples of things that I think from my research career that are pretty applicable in the real world. One of them I referred to earlier today, so I'll just touch on it very briefly. When I was asking Professor Carpenter his question about his research, I referred to this study that we published quite a while ago in the Journal of Applied Psychology. We were looking at reactions to merit pay increases, a longitudinal test of signal sensitivity perspective. One of the biggest things I'd have found out of that research wasn't that it takes about a 2.9% increase in pay for people to improve their performance and work harder. It was when I was the graduate student working on this paper, administering the surveys in a hospital, and several of the nurses walked up to me and said, this is a great research project, but I'm a nurse. I care about people. I don't care if you cut my pay by 10% or give me a 20% raise. I'm still going to give the best care that I can to my patients because that's why I do what I do. What I learned from that was not that we need to worry about how much of a pay raise we give people, but figuring out what is the why to what they're doing. What motivates that individual to do what they're doing? Are they motivated by helping people, or are they motivated by getting the biggest salary that they can? Both of those are acceptable motivations as long as you know what they are and manage those people based on the motivations that they have. Second research article here is how leaders perceive employee deviance, excusing favorites while blaming victims. This we just got published in the Journal of Applied Psychology. I've been working on this project since 2008. So if there are any grad students here who are looking forward to their academic career after grad school and think it's going to be great and fantastic, just remember that some projects take you over a decade and 7 different journals to get published, right? So what came out of this research? Well, one of the things out of this research is that it changed drastically over that decade, and ultimately it became a paper about victim blaming. This paper got published. One of the co-authors' schools wrote up a summary of it and submitted it to Reddit, if you're familiar with that webpage, where people can upvote or downvote articles. And this article received almost 50,000 upvotes and became I would call it, nerdy viral, right? This isn't like a cool YouTube video of a guy jumping off of a building and living to tell about it. This is about research. So that's as viral as research can get. What did we learn from this, and what can we use from this? The main finding from this research is that if 2 people are being rude or incivil to one another within the workplace, the person who is the lower performer is going to get blamed for all of that rudeness or incivility, regardless of who was actually performing the rudeness. How can we use that? Well, as managers, we have to be sensitive to these situations. Now, one of the things that was very lucky about this is that it took a decade to get published, because a decade ago, this term, victim blaming, really wasn't out there in the public. So it was very fortunate for us that research got delayed in getting published, because it actually was very timely that it came out about 5 months ago. Now, this one down here, we've talked about some in our other session today, a social network perspective on leader-member relationships, accounting for the instrumental value of leader and follower networks. Well, one of the arguments that we've had today is leader-member exchange, the study of leaders and their followers, or leaders and their members, is the value of that relationship and the quality of that relationship and how important it is. One of the things that we found in this that wasn't one of the direct aims of the research was that leaders and their members do not agree on the quality of the relationship. They correlate somewhere between a 0.15 and a 0.30, meaning if I'm a leader and I think our relationship is good, it's unlikely that the follower or my subordinate or my employee agrees with me. So as a manager or a leader, that's evidence that I have to use, that just because somebody is telling me everything's great, and I think my relationship with that employee is great, that doesn't mean it's necessarily the case. They may be hiding some underlying disdain for me or disagreement with me that they're not willing to speak up about. Now finally, this piece of research, and I point this one out in particular because it's never actually been published in a journal. And sometimes the best research that we do doesn't get published because it doesn't find the right home, or we're not good enough at selling it. This piece of research I've been working on for over a decade with one of my colleagues who actually comes over from the University of Oklahoma and teaches at CU across town every year. And the big finding from this is that, and we discussed this in an earlier session, was that we were studying advice-seeking behavior, seeking advice from people in the workplace, and how that impacts your influence within the company. What we found is that you can ask for advice and actually build your influence, your reputation in the company, but you have to be very careful with it, because if you go to the same person too many times, you all of a sudden aren't building influence, but you're costing yourself influence. You are looking needy and incompetent. Whereas if you ask for it the right number of times, you're paying the person a compliment because you think they're smart, you look like you want to learn, you look like you're malleable, and you're seeking out data and evidence, right? But what we find is that although you can cost yourself influence by asking too many questions, if you spread that question asking around to different people, you find an inverse relationship. So you shouldn't seek advice from one person lots of times. You should seek a little bit of advice from many different sources, which brings us back around to talking about evidence-based management. That evidence-based management is much like asking for influence. You need to seek information from lots of different sources to get lots of different points of view and perspectives. Now, how have I used this? Well, I've used this in my MBA director role, and I know I'm running short on time, right, Joseph? Am I getting close? To develop my curriculum by looking at many different colleges and look at how their enrollments are and how their programs are growing. To look at admissions and delivery changes. We have looked at online, face-to-face, and hybrid different delivery types. We look at GMAT admission portals and different. One of the things that I'm looking at now is looking at the return on investment of all of my marketing activities and our different delivery methods. So one of the things that I'm going to do is look at our overall enrollments, but I'm also going to look at class enrollments. If we create these online, face-to-face, and hybrid mixed type classes, where do people choose to enroll? Which class type actually brings students into our program? I actually this morning got an email from one of our marketing managers that gave me all the stats on our Facebook ads. One of our Facebook ads reached 57,000 people. It got 1,000 clicks and a 0.56% result rate of people actually engaging with us. And we know that, unlike a billboard that has 0 ways of measuring its return. So I want to leave some time for questions here. So I'm going to skip over here to the wrap-up. So evidence-based management is not the answer, but it's part of the answer. It's a matter of asking the right questions, seeking out the right data sources, and bringing all those data sources together to make better, but still not perfect decisions. It's a matter of evidence, experience, and intuition, experimenting, and making sure that you're meeting stakeholder needs. So with that, I will open it up for questions about my research, about evidence-based management, or anything in general. Thank you.